All right, we're turning the page now to the last part of the Deuteronomistic history, and that is the Book of Kings. Whoa, look at all that. There it is. So the Book of Kings is broken down into two parts, First and Second Kings. And you know that the Deuteronomistic history goes from Joshua through Second Kings. And so this series of lectures is where we're going to end out the Deuteronomistic history. Well, First Kings starts with the succession narrative. Who is going to be king after David dies? David is old and feeble and impotent and laying on his bed, and the only thing that he has to keep him warm is this concubine named Abishag, and she lays next to him and keeps him warm. And he's about to die, and then he does. And Adonijah, his son, proclaims himself as king. Adonijah is the next in line to the throne, so it makes sense that Adonijah would say, hello, I'm king, I'm the rightful heir. However, Bathsheba, remember Bathsheba, the one that David raped and started this whole chain of events to make him into a total scoundrel. Bathsheba gets together with the prophet Nathan. So apparently this is Bathsheba, and here is Nathan. And they come up with a scheme instead of Adonijah, while David is still alive. So hold on. David is still alive when Adonijah says he's king. That's troubling. Anyway, Solomon is eventually proclaimed king, and David's kind of in on it. And they figure out a way that they can go to this specific place where kings can be proclaimed, and Adonijah doesn't know about it. And Solomon, the son of David and Bathsheba, becomes the king in David's place. That's the important thing. Solomon becomes the new king. Now, when you look at 1 Kings chapters 3 through 4, you find that God speaks directly to Solomon. And God says, hey, Solomon, what would you like me to give you? You are the new king, so what is it that you're after? And Solomon, well, I'm expecting that you've read it, Solomon, instead of asking for wealth, which is what Yahweh expects him to ask for, he asks for wisdom so that he can rule well. And so because of that, Yahweh chooses to give him both wealth and wisdom. And international fame. So Solomon becomes known for his wisdom. And one of the stories that's told about that is the one that I'm going to have you read for your discussion board and tell me what you think of it. So this is the story of the two prostitutes fighting over the baby. The Bible is interesting. It's got a lot about prostitutes in it. And usually they're kind of good characters, which is fascinating. Okay, so Solomon, though, has a couple of downfalls. If his dad had a soft spot for the ladies, namely Bathsheba, Solomon's going to have the same sort of trouble. By the time you get to all of Solomon's wives and all of his second-class wives, concubines, he's got 700 wives and 300 concubines. Now, in the ancient world, if you were a king, the reason that you married women was so that you could make an alliance with their nation. And so that's probably what Solomon's doing here. However, remember, the people of God are not supposed to be marrying foreigners, according to our Deuteronomistic historian, because Deuteronomy says not to. So Deuteronomy 17:17 says that kings are not supposed to marry foreign women, and also kings are not supposed to amass a whole bunch of wealth for themselves. Now, David has not really amassed a whole bunch of wealth, but we're going to see what Solomon is going to do. So Solomon enters. He starts off good, a lot like David did, because he asks for wisdom rather than wealth. But very quickly, we're going to find out that he is not the kind of king that our Deuteronomist, Hermione, really likes. We find out in 1 Kings 5 through 8 that Solomon organizes the kingdom really well. He's a really skilled and wise leader of this people, but he also taxes the people within an inch of their life in order to build up the whole nation, to try to make fantastic buildings and wonderful infrastructure. He's going to tax the people a lot. He starts a building campaign for his palace to make it a little bit bigger, and Solomon is going to be the one that is going to be allowed to build a temple for Yahweh. You'll remember in 2 Samuel chapter 7, David wanted to build a temple for Yahweh, and Yahweh said, no, you're not going to build me a temple. I'm going to build you a dynasty. Well, with Solomon, Yahweh finally gives the go-ahead, the green light, and Solomon is allowed to build a temple for Yahweh. But look at the difference here. The temple is a lot smaller than Solomon's palace turns out to be, which is somewhat telling. And one of the other things that Solomon is going to do is tax caravans that are coming through and force foreigners into forced labor, into slavery. And you guys will remember that when we read in Leviticus, that's not allowed. Treating other people like Pharaoh treated people is not okay for the people of God. They're not supposed to act that way. And so even though you're Deuteronomist, Hermione is happy that Solomon sought wisdom and that he builds a really nice big nation. She's also frustrated, one, because he marries so many foreigners, and two, because he treats people as expendable the way that Pharaoh would treat people. Well, at the temple dedication in 1 Kings chapter 8, it is quite an affair. Solomon has finally solidified the deal. He has created a temple for Yahweh to dwell in. Yahweh doesn't have to live in the tabernacle anymore, which is a portable tent. Instead, what happens, and this is miraculous, Solomon has managed to build a permanent dwelling place for Yahweh. And if you have in the back of your mind that covenant with Abraham, you're going, oh, this is wonderful, because finally the people of God are solidified in the land of Canaan. And what happened when they went into slavery in Egypt, or when they traveled up and down and had no homeland, that is not on the table anymore, or at least so it would seem. Because number one, there is a dynasty that is set up, and Yahweh has made it an eternal dynasty through the covenant with David. And also now Solomon has created a temple for Yahweh to dwell in, which means that Yahweh's home is permanently affixed to Canaan. Nothing bad can happen, right? Well, as a part of Yahweh's pleasure with this move, and Yahweh saying, you have done the right thing, in 1 Kings chapter 8, we see a cloud of acceptance descend upon the temple at the dedication of the temple. And if you remember back in your reading for the wilderness wanderings from Leviticus and Exodus, when the people were living in the wilderness with Yahweh living in the tabernacle, Yahweh was always represented during the day by a pillar of cloud. And that was what they would look to know that Yahweh's presence was there in the tabernacle, was that cloud. And at night, it turned into a pillar of fire. But what we find out in 1 Kings 8 is that when Solomon has completed building this temple, a big old cloud of Yahweh's presence descends upon it and sits on the temple. And so this lets everybody know that Yahweh is really there. Yahweh is taking up residence in this temple. And then Solomon prays. And this is a prayer in chapter 8 that is probably composed by your Deuteronomist, by Hermione. It's not likely that Solomon actually said this, but he prays and he says, Lord, all of the heavens cannot hold you. How much less to dwell in this temple made of stone. So it's this statement that says, I know that you dwell here in the temple. However, I also have this realization that not even all of the heavenly spaces can contain you. And that is going to, because you know that we're headed towards exile, that is going to offer comfort to people in the midst of exile, that Hermione, our Deuteronomist, adds this little bit in, that even at the dedication of the temple, there is this recognition that the temple isn't really Yahweh's home. It's going to get destroyed in 587. It's not really where Yahweh lives, but Yahweh lives in heaven, and not even the heavens can contain Yahweh. So that's what's going on with Solomon. Solomon dedicates the temple. It's this permanent structure for Yahweh. But right after Solomon, we have Solomon's son, Rehoboam. Now, Rehoboam is a total hack, for lack of a better way of putting it. So in 1 Kings chapter 12, we find out that Rehoboam takes over the kingdom from Solomon after Solomon has died. Things have gone fairly well during Solomon's rule, except that the people were taxed within an inch of their life, and Solomon married foreigners. And so the people come to Rehoboam, his son, and they ask him, could you please lighten up on the taxes and stop enslaving foreigners? And he says, he consults with his dad's advisors, who are really wise, and they say, yeah, you need to lighten up. And then he consults with his young friends, and his young friends say, you got to go harder. You've got to tax them more so that they'll respect you. And so his response to the people is, if you thought that my dad was a harsh taskmaster, you ain't seen nothing yet. And he says this thing that his pinky finger is stouter than his dad's loins. So pretty much what he's saying is that he's making this penis kind of comparison where he's saying, I've got a bigger one than my dad did, essentially, which is a very childish thing to say. And he's followed the advice of his young friend, which is also a very unwise thing to do. And because of this, the northern tribes are going to rebel against Rehoboam and Rehoboam's rule. So if Solomon was the king of wisdom, Rehoboam is going to be the king of folly. He is the opposite of his dad. He doesn't have wisdom. He listens to the advice of his young friends rather than sage advice. He makes penis jokes. He's just the worst. He's like your friends in middle school. And so the northern tribes go off on their own. They form their own kingdom, and a guy named Jeroboam, not Rehoboam, but Jeroboam is going to be in charge of them. Now, Jeroboam, so we've got the kingdom dividing in half, and this is in 922, and this is one of the dates that you're going to need to know for the test. So in 922, the kingdom of Israel, the United Kingdom, divides in half. And 10 tribes belong to the north and 2 to the south. Excuse me. So the north is called Israel, and the south is called Judah because Judah is the biggest tribe in the south. The north is ruled by a military officer named Jeroboam, and the south is ruled by Solomon's foolish son, Rehoboam. So that we've got the breaking of the kingdom right here. This is very problematic. Now, Jeroboam, who becomes king in the north, does not want people going down to Jerusalem, which is in the southern kingdom, to worship at the temple that Solomon has built. And so what Jeroboam does is make little golden calves, and he says he puts one at Dan and one at Bethel. And if you go back here, you can see, you may not be able to see Dan and Bethel, but you might. So Bethel is down here, and Dan is all the way up here. And so he puts little golden calves there, and he says, you can go to these sites, and that's where you're going to worship Yahweh. And he even says that this golden calf, this isn't actually a golden calf, but it is a calf, a picture of one that has been found archaeologically in the region of Canaan. He says, you can worship these calves instead of going to Jerusalem. And this calf is what brought you out of Egypt. It's a really striking thing to say. This idol is what's responsible for having brought you out of Egypt. This, in fact, he says, is Yahweh. And so you should be totally shocked when you hear that Jeroboam has done this in the north, because he set up idols. Yahweh's not supposed to have idols. And they're little golden calves, which might remind you of the incident right after the people of God came out of Egypt, where they were tempted to worship a golden calf, and the wrath of God came upon them. So Jeroboam does a really terrible thing by setting up these golden calves and telling people to worship them and telling them not to go to Jerusalem to worship Yahweh in Yahweh's temple. That's his big mistake. that's the end of this lecture. Come back and we'll talk a little bit more about what happens after the division between the North and the South.